This is a reading of an Aristotelian dialogue concerning the geocentric and heliocentric cosmologies, Contra Galileo, which I am the author of, which you can find a copy of in the archive and Amazon links below. This portion will cover the question of whether heavier bodies fall faster and lighter bodies fall slower, or whether all earthen bodies fall at the same rate of speed, which Galileo is famous for having argued against the Aristotelian position, and that this entire problem is wrought with confusion, as you will find that today, nobody can even provide an accurate representation of Galileo's argument, nor his position, but that the people that try to explain this problem can't even reiterate Galileo's argument. Neither do they know his position, and neither do they know the peripatetic position and how insignificant this sort of problem was for Aristotle. That this was not an overthrow of Aristotelian physics, because Aristotelian physics is not so demeaning, is not concerned with insignificant pursuits, but is concerned with things like whether or not motion occurs along a continuum that is infinitely divisible or along discrete stages. But those who are unfamiliar with Aristotle's physics and generation and corruption and on the heavens think that there is some significance to his claims that are rather anecdotes. That Aristotle doesn't focus on questions about what kind of bodies fall faster. Those things are mentioned on the side in the pursuit of greater and more important questions. While Galileo's position, likewise, is misrepresented and not understood, because they never read Galileo's dialogue concerning the two chief world systems, and physicists or philosophy of physics has completely run astray to even being relevant to any considerable question. And so what you find as explanations of the problem is a complete misrepresentation of either of the sides, not even representing Galileo's side that they argue for, but completely misunderstanding the whole problem. They don't know what Galileo was saying, and they don't realize how insignificant these sorts of diversions are to the Aristotelian perspective. So I will begin with the reading because the situation is explained very clearly there. Recall that this is set during the Inquisition, and Galileo is answering to questions set forth to him by Simplicius of Cilicia in the court of Pope Urban VIII, who I call Pontifex Urban VIII, in order to not compound disgrace. So to begin, Pontifex Urban VIII. Now, I wish to hear a discussion between you, Galileo, and Simplicius about falling bodies, because you have gained a widespread reputation thereby, and more so, I believe, than for any astronomical discoveries or for inventions of scientific instruments, which you are famous for, like your telescope. And again, for contradicting and appearing to overthrow Aristotle. Again, Pontifex Urban VIII. Now, I wish to hear a discussion between you, Galileo, and Simplicius about falling bodies, because you have gained a widespread reputation thereby. More so, I believe, than for any astronomical discoveries or for inventions that you are famous for, of scientific instruments like your telescope. And again, for contradicting and appearing to overthrow Aristotle. Simplicius of Cilicia. I refrained from bringing up this contention, Pontifex, because the rate of speed at which heavy bodies fall is never a primary concern of the inquiries conducted by the philosopher. That is mentioned by him not even as a premise of an argument about any topic, and certainly not as a targeted conclusion, but rather as a sort of side note alongside something else that is said about weight, lightness, motion, and the elemental bodies. In my opinion, Galileo used his apparent overthrow of an insignificant footnote of Aristotle to catapult his reputation and thereby gain recognition to his other theories. Neither do I think that Aristotle himself would find it worthy of himself to contend about such trifling trivialities. Such distinguishes the menial topics and targets of investigation of these new scientists from that of natural philosophy and ancient physics. Commentators on Aristotle's Physica, De Caelo, and on generation and corruption don't even expand on or even mention such niceties and particulars that are irrelevant in the general scope of his arguments. And the commentators, including myself, explain the embedded significance of almost every detail of those texts, which I remind you are his lecture notes, and that his dialogues and works meant for publication have since been lost. Since, however, Galileo has derived widespread recognition for overthrowing these particulars in the lecture notes of Aristotle, I am desirous to defend the philosopher who I think was not even overthrown in these matters either. Although they, like I said, were for the most part irrelevant to his arguments and mentioned alongside the immediate premises and conclusions relevant to the topic at hand. Pontifex Urban VIII. What then would you like to say in defense of Aristotle about this contention brought about by Galileo that has won him widespread recognition? Simplicius of Cilicia. His arguments can be picked apart dialectically. However, he also, as in other places and about other topics, misrepresents the arguments of the philosopher. So there is a sort of difficulty in approaching these problems at once. Pontifex Urban VIII. I should say the issue is not altogether clear to me. Simplicius of Cilicia. In some cases, Pontifex, he somewhat agrees with our conclusions, but adding complexities, compounds, variables, so that he might be thought to say something novel and not before claimed. I will provide a quotation from his discourses and mathematical demonstrations relating to the two new sciences, which was an important book of Galileo's. Quote, the experiment made to ascertain whether two bodies differing greatly in weight will fall from a given height with the same speed offers some difficulty because if the height is considerable, the retarding effect of the medium, which must be penetrated and thrust aside by the falling body, will be greater in the case of the small momentum of the very light body than in the case of the great force of the heavy body. So that in a long distance, the light body will be left behind. If the height be small, one may well doubt whether there is any difference. And if there be a difference, it will be inappreciable. From this passage, it is clear that he admits and consents to the peripatetic doctrine that, if we may call it that heavier bodies really fall at a greater speed than lighter bodies, all else aside. However, in what follows, he argues for an additional variable alongside weight, that is surface area, that in conjunction with air resistance reduces the speed of falling bodies. This complicates the issue more so than contradicts the position held by Aristotle. Pontifex Urban VIII. So Galileo doesn't say that heavy bodies don't fall faster than bodies of less weight. Again, Pontifex Urban VIII. So Galileo doesn't say that heavy bodies don't fall faster than bodies of less weight. Simplicius of Cilicia. Well, as I said, the issue is complicated, and he makes that claim. However, with the peculiar qualification that heavy bodies wouldn't fall at a greater speed if they were to fall in a void without air resistance. Again, Pontifex Urban VIII. So Galileo doesn't say that heavy bodies fall faster than bodies of... So Galileo doesn't say that heavy bodies don't fall faster than bodies of less weight. Simplicius of Cilicia. Well, as I said, the issue is complicated, and he makes that claim. However, with the peculiar qualification that heavy bodies wouldn't fall at a greater speed if they were to fall in a void without air resistance. Pontifex Urban VIII. I do not know what to make of that. Simplicius of Cilicia. Neither do I, as the physical speculation has to do with heavy bodies falling in and through air and not any other medium. The complexities that arise in his investigation of the topic are, as I said, worth ignoring and disposing of, as a peripatetic defense would be futile and require an effort that exceeds the gain. Pontifex Urban VIII. Nonetheless, Galileo's reputation seems to be magnified by the dispute surrounding this topic. Simplicius of Cilicia. That is right. However, Aristotle's reputation has nothing to do with such inconveniences. Pontifex Urban VIII. Yet per accidens, Galileo's appearing to champion the philosopher about this seems to have elevated the credibility of his refutations of Aristotle regarding the topics of astronomy and physics in general. Simplicius of Cilicia. You are right. However, from a philosophical perspective, no harm has been thereby affected upon the peripatetic doctrines. Among the many, of course, persuasion has ensued from such an irrelevant and accidental appearance of a dispute. Pontifex Urban VIII. I still think you should say more about the situation. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then I might refer to another passage from the same book. Of his. You will see that he consents to the peripatetic position with the addition of peculiar additions. Quote, if Simplicius is satisfied to understand and admit that the gravity inherent or interna gravitas in various falling bodies has nothing to do with the difference of speed observed among them. Again, if Simplicius is satisfied to understand and admit that the gravity inherent in various falling bodies, the interna gravitas, which is the weight. Gravitas means weight in Latin. First of all, let me say this. When people say that gravity is something other than weight, it's some kind of occult force. The word gravitas in Latin means weight. Again, if Simplicius is satisfied to understand and admit that this gravity inherent in various falling bodies, that this interna gravitas, this weight in various falling bodies, has nothing to do with the difference of speed observed among them, and that all bodies, insofar as their speeds depend on it, would move with the same velocity. Pray tell us, Salviati, how you explain the appreciable and evident inequality of motion. Please reply also to the objection urged by Simplicius, an objection in which I concur, namely that a cannonball falls more rapidly than a bird shot. Again, this is from Galileo's other work, titled Discourses and Mathematical Demonstrations Relating to the Two New Sciences, page 84, or around there. Here Pontifex says, this is Simplicius of Cilicia. Here Pontifex, it is clear that he admits that a cannonball falls more rapidly than a bird shot. He explains why and what cause he attributes to that in the following passage. Quote, the action of the medium in producing a greater retardation upon those bodies which have a less specific gravitas or weight has already been explained by showing that they experience a diminution in weight. Again, the action of the medium of air in producing a greater retardation upon those bodies which have less specific weight or gravitas has already been explained by showing that they experience a diminution of weight. Again, he's admitting that the medium of air produces a greater retardation or slowing down upon those bodies which have a lesser weight, in order to explain why heavy bodies fall faster. The action of the medium of air in producing a greater retardation and slowing down upon those bodies which have a less specific gravitas, that is weight, has already been explained by showing that they experience a diminution of weight thereby. Thus, he attributes the difference in speed observed among falling bodies of different weights. Thus, he attributes the difference in speed observed among falling bodies of different weights to the medium through which they fall, not to the weight of the bodies themselves. After which, he later claims that if the bodies of different weights were falling through a void without air resistance, then they would fall with the same speed. I assume he makes this leap. I assume he makes that leap to the exclusive causality of air resistance on surface area without attributing a significance to weight. From first, the mutual causes of weight and the drag from surface area along air resistance. This is Simplicius again. I assume he makes that leap to the exclusive causality of air resistance on surface area without attributing a significance to weight from the mutual causes of weight and the drag from air resistance. I assume he makes that leap to the exclusive causality of air resistance on surface area without attributing a significance to weight from the mutual causes of weight and the drag from surface area along air resistance. There is a subtlety about mutually causative factors and attributing the cause as a whole to one or the other of them, which I think is the issue we face in this dilemma. Pontifex Urban VIII. Then you say that the dilemma comes down to a question of logical validity. Simplicius of Cilicia. That is how the problem unfolds upon my own speculation. I would like, however, to pose questions to Galileo. Pontifex Urban VIII. You may proceed with the interrogation then. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then Galileo. Is not the force required to lift a heavy body equal to the force with which it falls? Again, Galileo. Or Simplicius of Cilicia. Then Galileo. Is not the force required to lift a heavy body equal to the force with which it falls? Galileo. I believe it to be exactly so. And it is for this reason that two equal weights in a balance are seen to remain steady and in equilibrium, the heaviness of one weight resisting being raised by the heaviness with which the other, pressing down, seeks to raise it. Simplicius of Cilicia. And that the force required to lift the body is equal to its weight? Galileo. Yes. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then forget about this speed. We agree, do we not, that the force with which a body falls is equal to the force required to lift that body? Galileo. We agree about that. Simplicius of Cilicia. And those are counter forces. The force with which a body falls and the force required to lift or transport that body. Galileo. Yes. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then you would also say, would you not, that the force required to lift a given body is the counter force of its weight? Galileo. Yes. Simplicius of Cilicia. And we said that the force required to lift a given body is the counter force of the force with which that body falls, did we not? Galileo. We said so. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then can a thing have more than one contrary, or is there only one contrary available to any given thing? Galileo. A thing can only have one contrary. Simplicius of Cilicia. And the counter force is the contrary of the force in question. Galileo. Yes. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then, if the force required to lift a given body is the counter force of both the force with which that body falls and to the weight of the body, and a thing can only have one contrary, and the counter force is the contrary of the force in question, then are not the weight and the force with which a body falls one and the same? Galileo. Yes, they are. So this argument is important. First, the force required to lift a heavy body. The force required to lift a heavy body is equal to the force with which that body falls. The body falls with the same force or an equal force that is required to lift the body. Then the force required to lift a body is equal to its weight. Again, the force required to lift a heavy body is equal to the force with which the body falls. And the force required to lift a body is equivalent and equal to the body's weight. You have to produce the amount of force to lift something that is equivalent at least to the weight of what you're lifting. So premise one, the force required to lift a heavy body is equal to the force with which the body falls. Premise 2. The force required to lift a body is equal to its weight. And the conclusion is that the force with which a body falls is equivalent and equal to its weight. Or rather, the force with which the force with which a body falls is the weight. Again, is not the force required to lift a heavy body equal to the force with which the body falls? Yes, and the force required to lift a heavy body is equal to its weight. Yes, then are not weight and the force with which a body falls the same? Since again, a further premise is that a thing can only have one contrary, and the counterforce of the falling body is the force required to lift a heavy body. So the force required to lift a heavy body is the equal counterforce of the force with which a body falls and of the weight. Obviously, the force required to lift a heavy body is the equal counterforce of the weight. And the force required to lift a heavy body is the equal counterforce of also the force with which a body falls. Then if the force required to lift a heavy body can only have one contrary, the counterpart, the equal counterpart is the contrary in question. Then the force required to lift a heavy body is the counterforce of both the force with which a body falls and the weight, which must be the same. So the force required to lift a heavy body is equal to the force with which the body falls. And the force required to lift a heavy body is equal to the weight. Then the force with which a body falls and the weight must be the same, as both are the equal counterforce of the force required to lift a heavy body. Again, then if the force required to lift a given body is the counterforce of both the if the force required to lift a given body is the counterforce to both the force with which a body falls and to the weight of the body, then are not the weight and the force with which a body falls one and the same? If the force required to lift a given body is the counterforce of both the force with which a body falls and to the weight of that body, then are not the weight and the force with which a body falls one and the same? As again, if the force required to lift a given body is the counterforce of both the force with which a body falls and to the weight of that body, and are not weight and the force with which a body falls one and the same? Galileo, yes, they are. Simplicius of Cilicia. Now, wind resistance or air resistance is, as you say, a sort of counterforce working against the speed of falling bodies in proportion to their surface area, whose declination is decelerated by the medium through which they fall. Is that right? Galileo, that is right. Simplicius of Cilicia. And as a counterforce, the air resistance of the medium through which heavy bodies fall must be a resistance against the force of the falling bodies, and I should say the weight. Galileo, that would seem right. Simplicius of Cilicia. And the force with which bodies fall is the same as their weight. We said that, did we not? Galileo, we said that. Simplicius of Cilicia. And we said the air resistance of the medium through which they fall resists as a counterforce both their speed and the force of their fall. Again, we said that the air resistance of the medium through which they fall resists as a counterforce both their speed and the force of their fall. Is that right? Galileo, yes. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then you must say that these, the speed and the force with which heavy bodies fall, is the same or related to as part to whole. I don't see any other option for you. Again, according to Aristotle and Plato, two things have to be related either as the same or different or part to whole. Galileo, I say then that they are related to as part to whole. For I claim that the speed of falling bodies is determined by both the weight and the surface area. And so the ratio between the weight and surface area of the body, according to my theory, culminate in the speed of the falling body. I say that weight must be equivalent. I say that weight must be equivalent and result in the force of a falling body. As we agreed, I say that the weight may be equivalent and result in the force of the falling body, but that speed is determined by both weight and surface area. Simplicius of Cilicia. But the weight, according to your colleagues, is comprised of both density and volume. Is it not? Again, the weight is the product of density and volume, according to them. Galileo, it is. Simplicius of Cilicia. And the volume is in proportion to the surface area, so that an increase in volume increases the surface area, and a decrease in volume decreases the surface area. Would you not say that? Galileo, I suppose I would. Simplicius of Cilicia. You said, did you not, that the volumes stand in sesquialter ratio to their surfaces, so that they increase and decrease according to the proportion of 3 to 2. Galileo, I said that. In his discourses and mathematical demonstrations relating to the two new sciences. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then volume and surface area are mutually dependent terms. Again, then volume and surface area are mutually dependent terms. Galileo, yes. Simplicius of Cilicia. And if we increase the volume of a given body while the density remains the same, does not the weight increase? Galileo, it does. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then, as we agreed, the density and volume comprise the weight of the body. Galileo, yes. Simplicius of Cilicia. And an increase or decrease in volume results in an increase or decrease in surface area as directly proportional. Again, an increase or decrease in volume results in an increase or decrease in surface area as directly proportional. Again, this is following the question that the weight is a product of volume and density. That volume and density are the mutual causes of weight. Then, regarding volume, which again is part of the equation that results in weight, an increase and decrease in volume, which is part of the product of weight, results in an increase and decrease in surface area is directly proportional. Galileo, yes. And contrariwise, Simplicius of Cilicia, and contrariwise, an increase or decrease in surface area must be accompanied also by an increase or decrease in volume. Galileo, that is true. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then, if volume is a mutual cause of weight alongside density, according to your conception, and volume is mutually dependent with surface area, is not surface area also a factor in weight? Again, if volume is a mutual cause of weight alongside density, according to your conception, and volume is mutually dependent with surface area, is not surface area also a factor in weight? Or if the density of a body remains constant, Could an increase or decrease in surface area alongside affecting an increase or decrease in volume not also affect an increase or decrease in weight, all else aside? Again, if the density of a body remains constant, could an increase or decrease in surface area alongside affecting an increase or decrease in volume not also affect the increase or decrease in weight, all else aside? Since volume, again, is a mutual cause of weight alongside density. And since surface area and volume increase and decrease proportionally. Galileo, that seems right. Simplicius of Cilicia. But you said the speed of falling bodies is determined by both weight and surface area, and not just weight alone. Again, he said that the speed of falling bodies is determined by both weight and surface area, not just weight alone. Did you not? Galileo, I did. Simplicius of Cilicia. Yet, according to the argument, surface area is a causal factor in weight, as an increase of surface area increases the volume by a sesquialter ratio, and an increase in volume, given that the density is constant and unchanged, increases the weight also. Is that right? Galileo, that follows according to the argument. Simplicius of Cilicia. Then weight as the whole comprising both density and volume. Then weight as the whole comprising both density and volume, the latter of which, volume, is mutually dependent with surface area, must as a whole comprised of the others be the sole cause of what you say is caused by both the whole and one of the parts. Again, then weight as the whole comprising both density and volume, the latter of which, volume, is mutually dependent with surface area, must as a whole, the weight comprised of the others be the sole cause of what you say is caused by both the whole and one of its parts instead of by just the whole. I don't see any way around that. Galileo, yes, however, a difference in shape, the other variables remaining constant, would still, according to my theory, affect the speed of fall. Simplicius of Cilicia. That is enough for me, however. For Aristotle himself says that shape indeed affects the fall of bodies. For he says the shape of bodies will not account for their moving upward or downward in general, although it will account for their moving faster or slower. The reasons for this are not difficult to see. For the problem thus raised is why a flat piece of iron or a flat piece of lead floats upon water, while smaller and less heavy things, so long as they are round and long, like a needle, for instance, sink down. And sometimes a thing floats because it is small, as with gold dust and the various earthy and dusty materials which throng the air. Galileo, then our positions are not so much as diametrically opposed to each other as they seemed. Simplicius of Cilicia, not in that respect, and not in this either. You say that all heavy bodies fall or would fall given that they are in a vacuum or a void with equal speed regardless of their weights. Although Aristotle says no such thing and denies the existence of a void. In a sense, he admits that all earthen bodies are absolutely heavy and all bodies of fire are absolutely light, in contrast with bodies that have a share of each. That is, in one sense, in alignment with your claim that all earthen bodies fall at the same speed. Aristotle does grant that all earthen bodies have absolute weight in comparison with the other elements, like water and air, since earthen bodies sink to the bottom of any medium that they're in. He, however, as you know, attributes their difference in speed of descent to their difference in weight. I'll provide the quotation for convenience. We may distinguish the absolutely heavy, as that which sinks to the bottom of all things from the absolutely light which rises to the surface of all things. I use the term absolutely with reference to the genus and to those bodies which do not combine lightness and heaviness. It is apparent, I mean, that fire in whatever quantity, so long as there is no external obstacle, moves upward and earth downward. And if the quantity is increased, the movement is the same, although swifter. But the heaviness and lightness of bodies which combine these qualities is different from this, since while they rise to the surface of some bodies, they sink to the bottom of others. Such are air and water. Such then, Galileo, are the reasons why I didn't initially attempt to address this disagreement between the peripatetic position and your own about this topic, especially with regard to the confusion about mutually causal factors and claims about one or the other of mutually causal factors having an exclusive causality. Again, especially with regard to the confusion about mutually causal factors and claims about one or the other of their exclusive causality. Again, especially with regard to the confusion about mutually causal factors and claims about one or the other of their exclusive causality. But also with regard to the complicated task of identifying, distinguishing, and resolving your view with ours. And finally, because Aristotle does not place great weight on these concerns, but references the points that you have attempted to disprove by the way, and as supplementary at best, neither, I say, as premises nor as conclusions of significant arguments of his. Pontifex Urban VIII. That is enough, I think. That is enough, I think, about that issue. And this discussion can be concluded there without any final address, for we are left now to weigh out amongst ourselves the various positions that have been represented and argued for and against in the preceding discourse. Now, perhaps I should say something about the Egyptian myth of the weighing out of the soul. It's a feather. And here you see that the Egyptians had a myth that the soul could be weighed against a feather. Then there's the remnants of the soul. Weighed out against a feather with Hermes and the other Egyptian gods. Then there's this idea that not only weight is not a factor in the speed of falling objects, but there's something else behind that. When the landing on the moon tested this hypothesis with a hammer and a feather. Now think about how a hammer is significant of Soviet Russia. On one side, you have a hammer and a feather. The NASA video says that the hammer and feather fell at the same speed. Meanwhile, the context is a conflict with Soviet Russia, which the hammer represents. And they say that these things are equal. I have a feeling that this has something to do with Soviet Russia and also something to do with Egyptian mythology and the idea that there's no, not just judgment of the soul, but that everybody, this sort of plebeian equality, that you're not judged for your crimes because these people are escapists and they don't just think that everything should be equalized. They think that there won't be redemption because the NASA experiment of dropping a feather and a hammer correlates with the Egyptian myth of a feather being weighed against a soul, that if the soul weighs more than a feather, then there's a descent. If the soul weighs more than a feather, or even if the soul flies up with fire, then the soul is not subject to descent and correction to be straightened out. I don't have much to say about this, but I know that there is much Bolshevik propaganda in the United States. And at that point, that was the height of the attempts of Bolshevik propaganda, Soviet propaganda. Now, what these people were doing on the moon is beyond my speculation. And they weren't attacking Russia. So you have the Egyptian myth of a feather weighed against a soul weighed against a feather. Those things weigh different. This is about weight and measurement and balance. Then you have the Soviet NASA video of a feather weighed with a hammer, which represents the Soviets and the Bolsheviks, where the feather is said to fall no slower than the hammer, and the hammer is said to fall at the same speed as a feather, and everybody's just equal. I don't think so. There's definitely some Soviet propaganda in the NASA circles. And that would require a thorough investigation to find out if they aren't just shipping missiles. They're probably just shipping missiles to our enemies instead of building rockets for space shuttles. They're probably telling us they're building space shuttles with our money. And they're probably sending missiles for use for Israel to use, or they're sending that to the Soviet Union. Before that, they would be sending missiles to the Soviet Union under the guise of producing space shuttles. Really, they're producing missiles and they're sending that to the Soviets and the Bolsheviks because they have this fake experiment or irrelevant experiment that they don't have to do shit like that. weighing out a hammer, which represents the Soviet Union, and a feather. When the Egyptian myth, which the Bolsheviks hate the Egyptians ever since Moses. Probably before that, where that is a myth of their judgment and retribution and the doctrine of retribution, not the kind of equality of these things being equal, of that what you will receive in the afterlife will be a balance of your actions here. And the weighing out of things is not that everybody has some equal condition, not that everybody has an equal place in society, not that the aristocracy is not more worthy and justified to rule over the plebeians, but that the only kind of equality that references is that your actions and your opinions will be judged and you will receive some sort of straightening out if that's necessary, or gifts and honor. You'll either be dishonored there or honored there. Not that we're all going to have the same result, not that we all should have the same, not that we all should have the same place in society, or that we all should have an equal say about the government, about the course of action that the state should take. But that there'll be some kind of equivalence made between what you deserve, where that can't be affected here, that will be affected there. And not an equivalence among things, not that all the proletariat get to be equal with the white guard, not that they have any say in society, not that they deserve it. That is what I think about when I see the NASA, which these people are the least trustworthy organization. Weighing out a hammer with a feather under some kind of parallel with the Egyptian myth of the afterlife.